everyone go ahead and settle down for just a second. We're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us here tonight, and thank you to the thousands of you at home watching via live stream. My name is Jamie Hahn, and I serve as the chairman of Young Americans for Freedom at Kennesaw State University. Before I begin, I would like to recognize several people and organizations who helped make this event possible. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Logan family for sponsoring this lecture and Young America's Foundation for their incredible assistance towards our chapter. I would also like to thank the KSU event staff for helping work out event details even to the last minute. Additionally, I want to thank the members of our chapter and community who have worked so hard to make this event a success. Young Americans for Freedom promotes the ideas of limited government, individual freedom, free speech, traditional family values, and a strong national defense. We desire to increase intellectual diversity by presenting ideas that cannot be found in our politically correct classrooms. Tonight, we have the great honor of hearing from someone who helps lead the fight for objective truth in a society that is only focused on living their truth. Michael Knowles hosts The Michael Knowles Show at the Daily Wire and the book club on Prager University. In 2017, he wrote the #1 national best-selling treatise, Reasons to Vote for Democrats, a Comprehensive Guide, which President Donald Trump hailed as a great book for your reading enjoyment. Before blank book fame, Michael studied history and Italian literature at Yale University, graduating with honors. At Yale, Michael rendered the first ever translation for the English stage, a political philosopher Machiavelli's play, The Girl from Andros, which scholars hailed as a watershed event for the English-speaking world. In 2017, he teamed up with acclaimed novelist and screenwriter Andrew Klavan to perform the 13-episode narrative podcast Another Kingdom, which garnered nearly 2,000 five-star reviews by the release of its final installment, rising to become one of the most popular art podcasts of the year before being renewed for a second season. The final season is available to download now. Michael appears regularly on virtually every popular television news program. He has lectured at research institutes and universities throughout the United States, and is a regular on national radio stations, as well as being a columnist at dailywire.com. Vanity Fair has described Michael as a dapper, lib-triggering troll. Please join me in welcoming Michael Knowles.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank YAF, as always, for hosting me. I want to thank the Logan family for sponsoring the Men Are Not Women and Other Uncomfortable Truths speaking tour this fall. And obviously, I want to thank Kennesaw State for the invitation. So far on this tour, we have discussed some really controversial stuff. We explained how men are not women. That was bad. We've shown that global warming will not destroy mankind within a decade. We have even had the gall to suggest that George Washington should not be erased from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We suggested that. Some might say these topics aren't controversial at all. Some would say that these truths are not at all uncomfortable. Why on earth should we have to explain basic facts on college campuses around the country? The reason is that simple truths are under attack, most especially at our institutions of higher learning. We have all heard of the subjects that are absurd and increasingly cropping up around colleges. There is lesbian dance theory at Northwestern. There is underwater basket weaving at Reed College and the University of Arizona and at Rutgers. There is a course at this university called Love and Sex, which I have just been told is protesting me tonight. I find this very ironic because those are two of my favorite subjects, but they are The professor sent out an email and said she expects all of her students to show up and protest me outside of this event because I said that men are not women and other uncomfortable truths. Now, these courses I actually get a real kick out of. They are perhaps incredibly stupid, but they are relatively harmless. They waste students' time, they waste parents' money, they waste all of the loans that you're all taking out, but at least they don't indoctrinate students in false and pernicious ideologies. Other college classes are less benign. Over the last 30 years, we've seen the proliferation of critical theory departments, what the late great literary critic Harold Bloom described as the school of resentment. These departments exist not to educate students in the classical liberal tradition or to glean from our literary and cultural tradition, the great wisdom of the ages. These departments exist to indoctrinate students in radical leftism and to teach them to despise their own civilization. I'm talking about departments like gender studies or queer studies or American studies. And there's a real irony here, because you'll notice all of the studies departments really like the subject that they're studying. All of them except for one. So you'll have women's studies. Women's studies reflects very positively on women. You have black studies, reflects very positively on black people. Only when it comes to American studies does the studies department detest the subject that they're actually studying. Every other one likes the thing except for American studies. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of American higher education. We know that the colleges are in trouble. We know that the colleges are a major source of the trouble. But the problem runs deeper than the university. The vast majority of Americans never graduate from college. And yet there is a widespread cultural confusion over very basic facts like biological sex, over the weather, and over key historical figures. All of that confusion favors leftism. Nearly 60% of Zoomers, Gen Z, believe that there are more than two genders. Over 60%, more than two sexes. So the cultural rot has obviously infected high schools and middle schools and elementary schools too, right? Sure, absolutely. But you can't lay all the blame on those early education institutions either, because the confusion over basic truths is not just widespread among young Americans. This past spring, after 2.5 years of investigation, tens of millions of dollars, Special Counsel Robert Mueller concluded that President Trump did not collude with the Russians. He did not commit any crime with the Russian government during the 2016 election. Despite years of press coverage to the contrary, the president didn't do it. And yet, polls conducted after the Mueller report show that nearly half of Americans continue to believe that Trump committed some crime with the Russians and rigged the 2016 election. We all saw the report. Nobody read it, but everybody saw it. You know, you read like 10 pages of it and you said, oh, of course I read the whole thing. Mueller spent several years and tens of millions of dollars investigating. The president didn't do it, and yet half of Americans think he did. This is not the fault of colleges. This is not the fault of high schools or middle schools or elementary schools. This fault lies with a far more popular instrument of miseducation, and that is the fault of the mainstream media. So many of the falsehoods that pervade our culture today owe their ubiquity to the mainstream media, which brings us to our latest uncomfortable truth. You know, I've tried to do a different uncomfortable truth on every stage of this tour, and tonight's is that the mainstream media really are fake news. The term fake news has a very convoluted history. It began with the comedian Norm Macdonald on Saturday Night Live. He was the first one to popularize fake news. Then, after the 2016 election, the left employed the term as a way of delegitimizing conservative news sources, my news outlet in particular, but other ones as well. Then, immediately, the right appropriated the term, and we used the term to refer to the mainstream media. That completely stuck. Why did it stick? Because the mainstream media are fake news. Take just the example of Russian collusion. The entire Russian collusion narrative began with an unverified dossier written by the British spy Christopher Steele and published by BuzzFeed in early 2017. If you didn't read it, you don't need to look too far into it. It included lots of lurid tales of ladies of the night and hotel beds in Moscow. And because this is a family-friendly lecture tour, I will just leave it at that, okay? Suffice it to say, the Steele dossier provided the basis for the special counsel investigation in the first place. The Steele dossier was compiled by Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS is an Oppo research firm that was hired by the Hillary Clinton campaign and by the DNC to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. Who staffed Fusion GPS? Lots and lots of mainstream media journalists, like former journalist Glenn Simpson, the founder of Fusion. Also on the payroll were operatives with ties to Democrat-employed government officials, such as Nellie Orr, who is the wife of a senior Justice Department employee under Barack Obama. Now, in September 2016, Barack Obama's FBI tried to get a FISA court to give them permission to spy on the Trump campaign. What did they use as the basis of that? The Steele dossier, cooked up by a British spy, paid for by Democrats through Fusion GPS. But the dossier wasn't enough, so the FBI had to go in and find a mainstream news report to back up the Steele dossier. They went out and they found a Yahoo News article written by Michael Isikoff. That was supposed to be independent corroboration of this Democrat-funded dossier. The trouble is, though, do you know who the source was for Yahoo News? I'll give you one guess. It was Christopher Steele, who was being paid for by the Democrats through Fusion GPS, through a bunch of mainstream media journalists and Democrat operatives, but I repeat myself. That investigation, in turn, kicked off a 2.5-year Mueller investigation, which led to countless media stories insinuating Trump's corruption. So, in short, you had Democrats hiring journalists to write stories to let them investigate Republicans so that the journalists could write more stories, all before any facts whatsoever came to light. By the time that President Trump was exonerated, by the time it came out that he actually did not do this crime, it was too late. He had already been convicted in the court of public opinion, presided over by the mainstream media. The media's ties to leftist politicians go much, much deeper than to any one candidate or any one scandal. In fact, for much of the Obama administration, it was impossible to tell the media from the political operatives because they switched their positions so frequently. Eric Erickson wrote an excellent summary of this in 2017, just to give you some idea. Jay Carney. Jay Carney was the press secretary for Barack Obama, but he was only the press secretary after he was a Time magazine journalist covering the 2008 election. Jay Carney's wife, Claire Shipman, continued to work in the media as a correspondent for ABC. Richard Stengel also left Time magazine with Jay Carney to work for Obama. Shally Murray wrote at the Washington Post until Vice President Biden hired her to work in his office. Her husband, Neil King, worked as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal until 2016 when he left to work for, I'll give you one guess, Fusion GPS. Linda Douglas left ABC News to work in Obama's White House. She then returned to mainstream journalism at The Atlantic before she became head of communications for Bloomberg, by which I mean the media company, not the politician who owns the media company. Sasha Johnson, a senior political reporter at CNN, left journalism to become Obama's Transportation Department spokesman. Jill Zuckman of the Chicago Tribune also went to work in the Obama Transportation Department. How about at the United Nations? Over at the UN, Obama's UN ambassador Samantha Power worked as a journalist for U.S. News, the Boston Globe, and the New Republic before she entered the administration, where she played a key role in spying on the Trump campaign during the 2016 election. Douglas France and Stephen Barr both left the Washington Post to work at Obama's state and labor departments, respectively. Also at the Post, Ruth Marcus married Obama's FTC chairman. Politico's John Allen left to work for former DNC chairman Debbie Wasserman Schultz before he went back to Politico and then later worked at Vox.com and NBC News. Then there's Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo, currently employed by CNN. Some people refer to him as the Fredo of the Cuomo family. I would never do that, but some people would do that. And before anybody gets excited, I am allowed to say that word because I am Sicilian. That is our word. It's not a big deal. I'm going to have to check with the chief diversity officer to make sure that I've the deputy chief diversity officer. Chris's brother. Who is Chris Cuomo's brother? Chris's brother is the current Democratic governor of New York. Who's Chris's father? The former Democratic governor of New York. Before he worked at CNN, Chris worked as ABC News' chief law and justice correspondent and the co-anchor of the ABC News show 2020. How about George Stephanopoulos? You remember him? The current chief anchor and political correspondent on ABC News. That guy, he's got to be pretty objective, right? He's the chief anchor. You know, that's the big job. Not only did he work for Bill Clinton's presidential campaign, he actually served as communication director for the Clinton White House, and he also served as Clinton's senior advisor for policy and strategy. And that is just the writers and reporters. I haven't even gotten into the executives yet. When you turn into the mainstream media executives, the connections become insane. Ian Cameron, executive producer on some of ABC News' top shows, is married to Susan Rice, Barack Obama's national security advisor, who famously used the mainstream media to sell the administration's lies and Benghazi cover-up. In the name of CBS News president David Rhodes. Do you know that name? Does that sound familiar? It might sound familiar because his brother Ben Rhodes was Obama's national security advisor for strategic communications. Ben Rhodes was instrumental in crafting the disastrous Iran deal. Ben Rhodes actually admitted on the record that he pushed a, quote, narrative to the media to sell this unpopular deal. I wonder how he got access to the media. That's so strange. Another advisor to Obama, Elizabeth Sherwood, shared a very cozy relationship with the press, you might say, and that's because she shared a bed with the president of ABC News, who is her husband, Ben Sherwood. Lest you think these connections are only to Barack Obama, let's not forget Virginia Moseley. Virginia Moseley, Washington bureau chief, vice president of CNN. Her husband, Thomas Needs, was Hillary Clinton's deputy secretary of state. That's not even all of them. I'm just tired of listing them. I could go on for another 2 hours. We don't have time tonight to go through all of the connections between the mainstream media and prominent leftist politicians. That's what makes the mainstream media fake news. The fake news is not fake because of the news they report and the news they cover up. It is also that, and we'll get to that in a second. But more importantly, the fake news is fake news because it's the press itself. The mainstream media are not really news outlets. They are overwhelmingly, from the reporters all the way up to the very tippy top of the organizations, leftist partisans peddling propaganda rather than reporters relating the news. Now, I said that the mainstream media are not fake news because they report fake news. They are also fake news because they report fake news, and there's a lot of that. The investigative journalist Cheryl Atkinson, who left CBS after the higher-ups at CBS wouldn't let her cover the corruption of the Obama administration, she compiled a partial list of 95 major falsehoods that the mainstream media have reported over just the last 3 years. In 2016, media outlets including USA Today, The New York Post, and Politico ran stories suggesting that Melania Trump had violated her immigration status by working as a model in the mid-1990s. You probably heard this one. I remember when this was in the news. It was such a perfect story to humiliate that awful anti-illegal immigration candidate, Donald Trump. Wasn't it just perfect? Trouble was, it was completely made up. That wasn't true at all. Politico, at least, had the decency later to run a correction. Most outlets did not, and most people, very likely, still believe that fake story. In October 2016, the New York Times and many other outlets suggested that President Trump had not paid any income taxes for 18 years. Now, you remember this one. The only way this one was proven false is when my doppelganger over at MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, was able to get one of his tax returns, and it showed that he had actually paid a higher tax rate than his predecessor, Barack Obama, and a higher tax rate than the socialist Senator Bernie Sanders. So he paid his fair share. But the mainstream media didn't want you to know that. In January 2017, Time magazine reported that Trump had removed a bust of Martin Luther King Jr. from the Oval Office. That racist, that racial bigot, oh, wait a minute, it wasn't true. Completely made up. The story went viral, even though there was no evidence whatsoever. Also in 2017, NBC News reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin had told Megyn Kelly that he had compromising information on President Trump, which was close, except actually Putin said exactly the opposite. But NBC almost got it right, they just got it completely backwards. That same year, the New York Times and CNN repeatedly regurgitated Hillary Clinton's claim that 17 American intelligence agencies had concluded that Russia executed election year attacks that helped steal Trump the White House. In fact, there were only 3 or 4 agencies, not 17, who ever suggested anything of this sort. CNN reported that Trump lied when he said the Trump Tower had not been wiretapped. The Trump Tower was wiretapped on multiple occasions. That's a fraction of the fake news reported in 2017 alone, just 1 year. Those are just the stories that involve Donald Trump. The fake news is a lot bigger than Donald Trump. Do any of you remember Smirkgate? Do you remember that awful event? A young man was wearing a hat just like you're wearing there. It was a red hat, and he had the audacity to slightly smile while minding his own business. And this became a national news story. What did they say? They said, because all you saw in the video was there was a Native American man and this guy kind of smiling a little bit. Former CNN contributor and current cannibal Reza Aslan said the boy had a punchable face. CNN analyst and fake Republican Ana Navarro baselessly smeared the young man as a racist. Turned out he hadn't accosted anyone. In fact, a group of black supremacists named the Hebrew Israelites, who were very well known to anybody who's ever lived in New York or D.C., they had approached the kids first, and they were screaming racial epithets at the kids and other derogatory terms. And that was before a Native American man came up with a giant drum and started beating it in the kid's face. If anything, the kid showed restraint. I don't know that I would react by slightly smiling to that kind of provocation. That's a lot of mistakes. That's a lot of mistakes for so-called investigative journalists. But even worse than the reporting of the fake news is the media's blithe disregard for correcting the record when the truth comes out. Because the mainstream media, this is how they get away with it. They run a false story on page A1. They blast it everywhere. It's the big headline. And then 3 weeks later, when it turns out it's not true, they run the correction on page Z75. And nobody reads that far into the newspaper, and nobody sees it come out. The Irish essayist put it very well, Jonathan Swift. He said, "Falsehood flies, and truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over. The tale has had its effect. Like a man who has thought of a good repartee when the discourse is changed, or the company parted, or like a physician who has found out an infallible medicine after the patient is dead." We saw an example of this just last week. After President Trump redeployed a small number of troops out of northern Syria, ABC News ran footage of what it said was the Turkish hellfire raining down on our ally, or sometime ally, the Kurds. ABC ran this footage on both its evening news show and Good Morning America. Only later did we find out the footage was not of the Turkish invasion at all. Didn't come from Syria, didn't come from the Middle East, didn't happen this week or last month or this year or the year before that. The footage came from a Kentucky gun show in 2017. Now, ABC quickly corrected the error in a very tiny little follow-up post to a tweet. They didn't do it on air. They couldn't immediately issue that on-air correction. They sent out like one little tiny tweet, and that was it. ABC World News Tonight has the largest nightly news audience of any show on network television, of any nightly news show. More than 8.5 million people saw the original fake news story. Another 4.1 million people saw the fake story on Good Morning America. How many people saw the corrections on Twitter, you ask? I have the numbers. According to the analytics, fewer than 22,000 people engaged with the tweets, both of them combined. Over 12.5 million people see the fake story with the fake video. 22,000 people see the correction. That is how fake news spreads. More often than not, the mainstream media don't issue any sort of correction at all. Why? Because nobody holds them to account for it. I'll take you back in the way, way back machine. On January 11th, 1970, the Washington Post reported, quote, "Scientists see an ice age in the future." You see where I'm going with this. The piece went on. Very important advice. I hope you heeded it in 1970. "Get a good grip on your long johns, cold weather haters. The worst may be yet to come." That's a long, long-range weather forecast being given out by climatologists, the people who study very long-term world weather trends. Those climatologists later met at Brown University, and they came to the consensus, their words, not mine, that, quote, "The natural end of our warm epoch is undoubtedly near." Consensus. Undoubtedly. Fake news. Of course, those same scientists today, those same universities and mainstream media outlets tell us that the earth is on fire and that human life will undoubtedly be wiped out within not just a century, but within a decade, unless we give the government all our rights and money. It's kind of funny how that works. Incredibly, gullible people still fall for this emotional manipulation. They call those who question the official narrative ignorant and unscientific. But of course, the advance of science and all of human knowledge depends precisely upon a healthy skepticism of official narratives and entrenched interests. After President Trump's election, the Washington Post adopted the pompous slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." It's a true statement. Democracy dies in darkness. Self-government is impossible in a society blinded by lies. The slogan, however, is ironic because the Washington Post is at the forefront of those lies. They're at the forefront of that darkness which is threatening our self-government. Fake news erodes self-government not merely by convincing people of things that aren't true. Worse yet, widespread fake news makes people cynical. Lies are just replacing the truth with falsehood. That's what liars do. Liars replace the truth with falsehood. Cynics don't think there's any difference between truth and falsehood. And this indifference toward the truth will mark the death not merely of some political institution or another, but of the culture itself. We must always prefer truth to falsehood, even when it seems uncomfortable, even when it costs us socially and professionally, even when the love and sex class protests you. Despite an entire mainstream media apparatus designed to feed us fake news, the truth will set you free, which is precisely why the left is so hell-bent on covering it up. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we have time for some questions. We have a rule over at the Daily Wire. If you disagree with me, you have to cut to the front of the line. I think this is a terrible incentive structure, but, you know, hey, that's what they tell me.
All right, so we have a couple rules for Q&A. If you're going to come up to Q&A, you cannot pass in front, all right? You got to go on the sides here. And you're going to line up behind this door on this side, okay, outside. And they're going to let you in, and I'll take your questions. You can talk to Michael Knowles. And I'm going to be holding the mic for you. You can't grab the mic, okay? So don't try to grab the mic. I'm holding the mic for you.
You know, the reason they have that line is because I did one of these at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and some weird masked Antifa guy busted in and sprayed me with some weird glitter and chemicals, and I can't afford another suit. I haven't sold enough blank books this week, so I think that's why we have that line out there, right?
Yes, all right. And one last thing also, when you come up, you're going to stand on this, this pink X, okay? And then I'll hold the mic up to you. So, all right, if we're ready for some Q&As, you got to go on the sides. Oh, also, when you're done with the question, please don't pass in front again. Either go up the side here or out and around, okay?
I'm going to need a master's degree to figure out those instructions, but it's very good.
Sorry.
Good.
All right, got our first question here.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming out. It was a great speech.
Thank you so much.
My only question is, if either now or after this event, would you mind signing my Crowder mug so I could then get it etched into the side?
It would be my pleasure to sign your Louder with Crowder ashtray. You just bring that up and I'd be happy to sign it. Oh, that's terrific. Color of ash, too. That's good. And I love your Cocaine Mitch shirt. Really great stuff. Thank you. All right.
Alrighty, next question.
Actually,
step on
sorry.
There you go.
I have a question about the. So recently in the news, there's been talk about Blizzard Entertainment and their way they've treated Blitzchung, and in the of his protest during the Hong Kong riots. I want to know, what is your opinion on it, and have you been hearing about the story?
I have been hearing. The story broadly is that Blizzard is censoring people who don't kowtow to the Chinese government. And it's not just Blizzard, it's obviously the NBA. The NBA is perfectly willing to join in protests of our own country, but you say peep about the communist government of China, which has 3 million citizens incarcerated right now in concentration camps, that's too much. Then LeBron backs down, he just wants to play basketball. It's not just the NBA either. It's Apple is doing this, virtually every American airline, JP Morgan, Princeton University, I mean, a ton of companies and institutions around the country. To say nothing of the US government, what this shows us is that he who pays the piper calls the tune. What this shows us is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, we have been, in this country, so happy to take cheap consumer goods from China. Who could lose? We've been so happy to have China become our largest creditor, fund our gigantic welfare state, fund whatever government spending we want, and that way we don't need to make hard decisions or raise taxes. We've been perfectly happy to take all that money when Hollywood goes into China. We've been perfectly willing to take all that money when other companies go into China. Except he who pays the piper calls the tune. And now we are censoring movies. In the new Top Gun, they're going to take the Taiwan flag off Tom Cruise's jacket because the communists of China don't like it very much. This shows us how important it is to take China seriously as an adversary. It means that we need to reclaim some of our manufacturing. It means that we need to not recklessly spend our money so that we're not beholden to them for financing all of our debt. And it means that we're going to make some hard decisions that maybe is going to hit our cheap consumer goods. Maybe it's going to mean we have to reform some of our entitlement programs. Maybe we'd have to raise taxes. I don't want to do any of that stuff. But it shows you the central question of our political era, which is, are we just going to be consumers in a one-world market that has no national loyalties, no ties of affection to community, nothing we really care about other than the almighty dollar, which the NBA right now is sacrificing any principles it once had just to preserve? Is that going to be our future? Or are we going to have a future where we have bonds of loyalty to our countrymen, where we believe in something greater than ourselves, and where we believe in something greater than selling our souls to make a cheap buck? I obviously hope that we pursue the latter course. Only time will tell, but I think Americans are waking up to this problem, and we realize that there are some prices that are just too high to pay. Yeah.
Hey, big fan.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask about a question about public education. You know, college isn't for everyone, and I think that's very well known, even though people like to propagate that lie. And I was curious, would you prefer a system where we actually allowed some students to skip high school and go directly into, you know, a welding program or a construction program, or maybe, you know, a veterinary and tech school, so that they could actually have the opportunity to build the skills instead of wasting their time in like algebra like 2, you know?
It depends on what kind of education they're getting in middle school. You know, a lot of things used to be taught a lot earlier that now are either taught later or are not taught at all. So I think it's important for all Americans to have a basic level of civics education. Otherwise, self-government goes away. I think it's important for all Americans to have a basic understanding of history. Certainly to have a basic understanding of the English language and how to write and how to read and how to understand the literature that makes our culture. Certainly all Americans need to have a basic understanding of mathematics. They need to be able to use their faculties of reason. In the olden days, they actually used to teach more trade-like courses in high schools. You used to at least have wood shop. Now that has largely disappeared. So if there were a way to guarantee that all Americans get a basic level of education and then can go on toward, say, a trade or some more specialized curriculum rather than being funneled into some more general college program where they're going to take out $200,000 of debt and statistically are not likely to graduate, I would certainly favor that system. But what I would fear in such a program is that it would just continue to lower the level of education that they're getting overall, and that would be a very bad thing. There was a study out of ISI that came out about 10 years ago. It showed that among the most elite universities in the country, they took a test of political and civics and history knowledge. The graduating seniors knew less about the history and the government of their own country than the incoming freshmen. They were actually getting more ignorant at their $100,000 a year college or $70,000 a year college. So you want to avoid a situation like that. You want to make sure there's a basic level of knowledge and then students can specialize, because education is also more than just book learning. I mean, education is actually how you are raised. When you're, you know, in Italian, if you say someone's misbehaved or a badly behaved kid, you would say maleducato, badly educated, brought up very badly. And so we need to take a much more broad view of education and what it means for the individual and not try to fit everyone into the same cookie cutter. This is the temptation of democracy, is to level everybody down and say we're all going to be the same thing. We're not. We're not all going to be the same. We're all going to be different. There's a wonderful diversity to our country. There's especially a wonderful diversity in education, and any system that can bring that out, I think, should be supported. Yeah.
Hi, so I hope you'll know what I'm referring to, but what are your thoughts on eating babies to stop climate change?
You guys are really giving me the tough questions tonight. All right, I'll give a straight answer. I oppose eating babies to stop climate change. All right, no wishy-washy here. I'm going to take a stand. Now, you know, there was a constituent in Queens who kind of did this stunt as a troll to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and said, the world's going to end in 10 years and we have overpopulation and too much carbon dioxide. We have to kill and eat the babies. And everyone laughed about this. And, she was pulling a political stunt. What people are not pointing out is that our socialist friend from Vermont, who's running for president, he said almost the same thing. He didn't say he's going to eat the babies, but he said in a climate change town hall, he said, in order to fight the weather, in order to fight the sun monster, we need to kill babies. He said that. He said abortion is very important as a strategy to fight the weather. And unbelievably, he said, it's especially important in third world countries. So he said, not only is it important to kill babies to fight the weather, but we specifically have to kill black and brown babies to fight the weather, because he's talking about babies in Africa and in East and South Asia. That is a horrifying statement. That is a terrifying statement, and yet that is the logical conclusion of so much of the left's ideological stance today. The idea that we're all just matter, we're all just material, we're all just clumps of cells, to use their phrase. So if you're a clump of cell when you're 3 weeks old, you're a clump of cell now, and there's no spiritual component of life, and there's no moral order, and you can just kind of do whatever you want to do, right? It's also the conclusion of this hysteria, this global warming Armageddon, that is now, it used to be within, they said within 100 years the temperature would rise by 2 degrees, and I think we'll survive it. Now we're being told that we're on the verge of a mass extinction event and that human life will be wiped off the face of the earth within 10 years. Obviously, that's not based in science at all. The purpose of that is to emotionally manipulate people into agreeing to morally abhorrent, terrifying, disgusting ideas, such as killing your own race to save your race, killing your species to save your species, killing little innocent babies in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world to save the trees. We're all joking about eat the babies to save the world. The left isn't joking. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Will, and my question is, with groups here protesting you and other conservative speakers like KS United and all these other groups on campus, what would you say is good advice for students to try and, push back against that, but still keep the moral high ground and stay on that moral high ground?
Always ask questions. Always ask questions. I was at GW the other day defending George Washington at GW because we are through the looking glass, my friends. And about 10 minutes in, this group of students, an alarm goes off because they couldn't keep in their head when they were supposed to stand up. So the alarm goes off, they jump up and they start yelling and shrieking and profanities and all these awful things. And I asked them, I said, what have I said that has offended you? What have I said that has infuriated you like this? They didn't have an answer. Not one of them gave an answer. I actually have a more empathetic take, or at least sympathetic take, on some of these crazy kids that show up to these colleges. I get protested everywhere. People called me a racist before this speech. I don't know what I said. They can't cite anything, or that I'm a bigot or I'm a hater or something like that. These kids are very angry about something. They're not angry about me. They're not angry about you. They're not angry about Donald Trump. But they are really, really angry. And I suspect they've got some reason to be. When you look at rates of depression, anxiety, stress, even suicidality among young people, they are through the roof, and they are especially through the roof among millennials and Gen Z. Diagnoses of depression are up about 33% in this country. Among Gen Z, it's closer to 45%. Suicidality among teenagers is up 70% among white children, 10 to 17, over the past 10 years. It's up 77% among black and minority children, 10 to 17, over the last 10 years, even though black and minority children tend to commit suicide at lower rates than white children. Something has gone seriously wrong, and it's not just affecting one demographic group, it's affecting a whole generation. What could it be? Well, there are many social ills. Obviously, divorce is through the roof. Many of these kids were raised in broken homes. They were raised largely without an education. They were denied any access to the great accomplishments of their own civilization. Increasingly, they were raised without religion, so they don't even have any sense of the moral order, any sense of purpose in this world. They are left with absolutely pitiful and pathetic questions about their own identity, which is leading to orders of magnitude more cases of identity disorder. Among the American population, about 0.2 to 0.6% of people have some confusion about their biological sex. Among millennials, certain studies show that numbers as high as 12%. People, because they have been denied on the religious level the access and a sense of the great I am. God describes himself as I am that I am. On the cultural level, they've been denied the identity of their civilization. On the personal level, they're asking this question, who am I? And they're trying to make sense of why they're so incredibly pissed off. And it's very easy to try to put that on a conservative speaker who's telling them truths that they've never heard before, even though those are basic truths. I think one commenter on social media said, I have a very punchable face. So I think it's easy for them to kind of throw their problems onto me or somebody else, but they're not angry with us. They're angry with themselves, they're angry with the choices that they have in many ways been led to make, and they're angry at their parents and they're angry at their society, which has largely failed them because of horrific, relativistic, nihilistic, leftist cultures that have robbed them of the sense of self. So I take pity on them, and I wish that they would come to these lectures because they might learn a thing or two. They might leave a little happier.
Hi. So first of all, a huge fan, and
Thanks.
Your talk was great. I know that there will always be people like you, like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, who speak out and for the truth. But as a young Catholic girl who aspires to be a mother, and especially raising children, how do you think, what different approaches should we take to raising kids in this kind of sort of new America, this culture that's very hostile to sort of people like us?
Private school. That's the real answer. Homeschool, Catholic school, any kind of private school. Because I was educated in public schools. I had a great time and loved all my teachers. I think there's something to be said for not shielding your students or your children from the realities that they're going to encounter in a world, even in a culture as broken as ours. But there is a line. And increasingly, you're seeing in kindergarten and first grade, not just kind of a liberal take on our history and on education, but a fundamentally backwards take on ontological questions. I mean, you're seeing gender ideology creeping into kindergarten and first grade classrooms. That is simply unacceptable. I mean, you're talking about kids who are extraordinarily impressionable, who by definition are ignorant. Children, you can't be a child and not be ignorant. That's what it is to be a student and to become educated. And they are being filled and indoctrinated in an ideology that is not only wrong and pernicious, but it's misery making, and you've seen the fruits of that for the last few decades. So I think it's important to make sure on the educational front they get a really solid foundation. That is going to begin with a religious foundation. It has to begin with that, because that is how you make sense of the world. That is going to be the grounding. Everything else, all of science, all of literature, rests upon these premises which are taken for granted, and those are fundamentally religious premises. From there you get the culture, from there you get politics. And kids are going to go through their liberal phases. I mean, this is, you have to. I think I was a liberal for about 3 weeks when I was a child. That was my big rebellion, though. I even sort of like John Kerry. I'm not proud of these things, okay? I'm not proud. This is confession time. But they're going to go through all of that, but if they have a decent foundation, then I think they're going to be able to come back, and just increasingly that is being denied by an educational system that doesn't even know what it doesn't know. The former defense secretary famously said that there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And he got made fun of for this, even though it's a very sophisticated idea, so I don't know why people made fun of him. The idea being there's some things that you know you don't know. And there are some things that you don't know that you don't know. The unknown unknowns. That's where our educational system is right now. They don't even know what they're missing. And you'll have to fill in that gap and then let them free.
Hey, Michael. So I was watching your podcast a few months ago, and you basically characterized the NATO alliance as an obsolete holdover from the Cold War. So I know all the arguments for NATO. I know about the invasion of Ukraine and Georgia, Baltic air provocations, and nuclear simulations by Russia on Denmark and Poland, for example. My question is, what's the argument against it? Why is it obsolete, a holdover?
What's the argument against NATO? Yeah. Well, I think you saw one of the arguments against NATO come out this past couple weeks, because we were told that we have to stick by our Kurdish allies, specifically the YPG, which is a sub-state actor and affiliated with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which officially the United States considers a terrorist organization. But we have a very good alliance with the YPG for the past at least 5 years. And we've had different alliances with the Kurds for the past 40 or 50 years. And we were told we had to abandon them for our NATO ally, Turkey, which is a 67-year NATO ally. Now, does Turkey really behave as our ally? Not very often. Erdogan certainly opposes our national interest often. But we've got nukes in Turkey. They're the second largest military in NATO. And they're a nation state. They're not sub-state actors. Ironically, the same people who were criticizing the president for betraying our sub-state actor allies, the Kurds, are the same people who attack him for undermining NATO. They seem to want to have their cake and eat it too, and you can't do that. What is the purpose of NATO? And when you think of a nation like Turkey that doesn't quite make sense perhaps anymore. The purpose of NATO was to stop Soviet aggression, particularly into Western Europe. It fulfilled its job. We defeated the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, we actually were able to take another rising power and pit it against Soviet Russia, and that was China. Now we're in a different situation. Now our chief adversary in the world is China. It's no longer Russia. This would suggest that perhaps it's time to recalibrate, and it's not just this administration that knew that, the last administration knew that. The administration before that tried to do it too. They wanted to reset relations with Russia, not because we're going in naively, not because we've got our eyes closed, but because in the 21st century, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're going to need some help in taking down Communist China, our chief geopolitical adversary. And so just as in the Cold War that you can pit China off of Russia, perhaps now we can pit Russia off of China. That is going to require looking at politics differently. The world order has changed dramatically since 1989 or the early 1990s, and so we need to adjust accordingly. Does this mean we need to dismantle NATO right now? Certainly not, but it means that we have to stop pretending that the world order became frozen at the end of the Reagan administration, because it didn't. Yeah.
Hi, Michael. I first want to say thank you for being such a strong pro-life advocate. As a fellow Catholic, that's a big issue for me as well. So my question has to do with the Georgian heartbeat bill that was just passed. It was a big victory. We got it signed, so go Governor Kemp. But what do you think the chances of it getting to the Supreme Court are, and how long till a bill gets to the Supreme Court that could possibly overturn Roe v. Wade?
The second question is the tougher one. I'm sure one of these bills will get to the Supreme Court. There's not just the Georgia bill, there's a Missouri bill, there's a Louisiana bill. These pro-life bills have cropped up around the country. It shows you why elections are important, by the way, because they've cropped up where there are good conservative governors to sign those bills into law. It's a very important bill. It will make it up to the Supreme Court. There have been some pro-life activists and advocates who have said it's a bad idea because we might lose it at the court. This is not my opinion. I think we fight the fight, and we lost it on Planned Parenthood v. Casey, but you keep fighting the fight and you're just going to keep plugging away. That's what the left has done for the past 50 years, and it's actually worked very well for them, and we're going to keep doing that as well. Still, I'm skeptical that certain justices on the court are actually going to vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. What I suspect will happen is you'll see a gradual chipping away at it, which will be unsatisfying to people who realize a person's a person no matter how small, but it will at least move the ball in the right direction. And that's what the pro-life movement has done so well. Since Roe versus Wade, when the left had decided they've had enough with this self-government thing, they've had enough with political debate, they are going to decide what's best for us. They thought they'd taken the abortion issue off the table. That was only the beginning. And the pro-life movement has only grown since then. I suspect it will continue to grow, but I think we would be engaging in wishful thinking if we thought that this latest round of heartbeat bills and anti-abortion bills is going to be the end of the issue. This fight is going to last a long, long time. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Michael. My name is Hannah. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Well, I guess my question would be, as a Venezuelan myself and seeing the terrors of socialism, what strategies could conservatives use to bring out conservative ideas to the Hispanic community, and also to make them understand why they should support or endorse Donald Trump, President Donald Trump?
Obviously, the Hispanic community is not a monolith. My favorite group in the Hispanic community are the Cubans, because they're the best cigars, obviously. But I have friends of all varieties in the Hispanic community. But it does tend to be the case that Cuban Americans vote in a more conservative way than immigrant groups from other countries, which, the left would like to pretend that voting is some sort of like automatic racial act, that just depending on the shade and hue of your skin, you're automatically going to vote for a certain candidate. That's obviously not the case. It comes from culture, and it comes from the civilizations and the countries that these people come from. So if you're fleeing communist Cuba, you're not fleeing so that you can get Bernie Sanders. You're not fleeing so that you can get more socialism. Unfortunately, immigrants from other countries vote different ways, and it also depends on the level of skill that they have coming here and the level of education sometimes as well. So I think one way to reach out is by cutting through the mainstream media narrative. I think so much of what keeps certain racial demographics away from conservative ideas is this lie they've been told that conservatives hate them. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, and the left pushes it because it's a way to keep people in their camp. Famously, Kanye West this year has had this revelation that you don't need to vote based on your skin color. I mean, Kanye West was the guy who said George Bush doesn't care about black people. That was the same Kanye West who is now holding Sunday services in MAGA hats saying we all need to worship Jesus and vote for conservatives. Who says miracles don't happen every day? But he's really... He describes it as going through a transformation. And what that transformation is not taking one ideology and going to a different ideology. It's going from this locked ideology and saying, hey, I have the right to think for myself. And people are going to call me all sorts of names if I think for myself, but so what? I don't care. Doesn't matter what people call you. It's that we're going to have to cut through. I don't think we're going to need to do a whole lot of convincing. Our ideas are better. And all these people are just people. They got the same brains in their heads that you and I have. What we need to do is cut through the noise of a uniform mainstream media that is persistently feeding them lies. And the only way that we can do that is by speaking out every chance we get.
Good evening.
Good evening. I love your T-shirt.
You like
Reagan Bush 84.
84.
That's great.
And I was old enough to actually remember that article from the 70s. So,
yeah.
Even with the abundance of fake news that's out there, what would you say do you believe are the top 2 or 3 reasons that people are so willing to believe it and abandon critical thinking when presented with those fake news stories?
Because it's not just the news. It's the news, and it's Hollywood, and it's the educational institutions. So basically anywhere that anybody is ever getting any information, be it in the popular culture, when they go to the movies, when they're turning on their television, when they're scrolling through their iPhones, or when they're in school from K through 12, and then for a third of Americans, another 4 years in college, and more after that for some other Americans, all they are getting is leftism. I grew up in a very left-wing place. I mean, I basically came out of the womb parting my hair and smoking a cigar and campaigning for Bob Dole. Even I was taken in by many aspects of leftism, not because I thought their arguments were better than the conservatives' arguments. It's because I was never, not even once, exposed to those conservative arguments. The reason why conservatives tend to do better, especially on college campuses, why they tend to understand politics a little bit better. I'm not just saying this from my own biases. You can see this in the work of Jonathan Haidt, has done studies on this. Conservatives understand leftists much better than leftists understand conservatives. Conservatives are much less likely to unfriend a leftist on social media than leftists are to unfriend conservatives. We're more willing to take in their arguments because that's the whole culture. And we're better able to respond to those arguments because the other side has never thought of ours. And I think that's why, in part, the left gets so angry, is because they're hearing something for the first time that they've never considered, and nobody can ever admit that they got stumped or that they got something wrong. You just get really angry and you say it's not fair, and the other guy's a racist. I think they're willing to believe it because they've never heard the alternative. And increasingly, I mean, there's a professor at this university who forced her students to protest me tonight based on nothing. I guarantee you she's never heard anything I've ever said. She's never seen any television show or any podcast or anything I've ever done. She's never read anything I've ever written. But she heard from some news source that I'm a really bad guy, and I'm a thisist and a thatist and a this bigot and that bigot. And so she told a classroom of students that they had to come protest me, which I believe is not constitutional. I don't believe that's legal. That's how deep that level goes. And so, you know, what we must do then is just engage very openly. It's just to approach them where they are. I have great pity for the people who believe that half their countrymen are deplorable and irredeemable. I have great pity for them. It must be really frustrating when they grab their pink hats and they shriek and they yell no and they're out protesting nothing on a beautiful night. I think, gosh, something's going really wrong in your background. And I think if we show them, you know, if we show them that we're not so scary after all and we just keep a level head, I think eventually that's the best chance we have of breaking through. Yeah. Thanks.
Hey, Michael, first off, I just want to say thank you so much to you, the Daily Wire, Ben. I am so thankful to see young people speaking out with strong conservative values. And I'm just wondering now, how do we get our schools back? We've given them over to the left, and look what's happened.
Part of the mistake that we made is we bought into the leftist premise that secular liberalism is the default position. So, you know, if you want to study any aspect of world religion, any aspect of Christianity, the religion that formed this civilization, if you ever want to study any of that, you know, that thing without which we can't understand anything else around us, yeah. If you want to study that, you got to do that on your own time. You got to go to church, you can't do that in school. You're not allowed to learn any important things here. This is a classroom. And that's not a default position. Secular liberalism is not default. That's one very narrow ideology, one very narrow worldview. And we ceded it, we gave it to them. You know, the left said in the 1960s that they were going to go on a long march through the institutions. And they did. They did go on that long march. And look at what it did for them. They took over the universities. The way we're going to take that back is through choice, though. We're not going to reclaim some of the institutions that have been completely gutted. We need charter schools, we need more private schools, we need more homeschooling. You're seeing all of that happen right now. That is greatly encouraging. And the classrooms and the campuses are a crystal ball. They're like looking into the future 20 years. Knock on wood, the next 20 years will be all right. Yeah. Amen. Thank you.
We're on to our last question.
Hello.
Hi. I have a request.
Yes.
A question.
Lay it on me.
So there's a lot of backstory to it, but I have an atheist friend who has fallen into the Marxist kind of worldview, and I've kind of seen we grew up together, and I was just going to ask if you would pray for him.
I would. I certainly would do that.
And then will you sign my book?
I would do that too. Slightly less important, but I will certainly do that because that's a good way to combat godless communism is with prayers, and I'll certainly do that. Do you have a pen? We don't. Who has a pen? I need a pen. Thank you. And thank you so much. All right. All right. I love this, too, by the way. This is Another Kingdom, which is a podcast that I read, but Andrew Klavan wrote. So I don't need to do any work other than read what's on the page, and I strongly recommend that you all go listen to it. All right. And I'm sorry, remind me of your name. Chrissy, that's right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you all. That's not even your phone. Sam, he or she? He. I'll pray for Sam. All right. Everybody pray for Sam. All right. Thank you all so much. It has been such a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm glad we could cut through some fake news. I'm glad that love and sex didn't take us down. That we were able to do it. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.